For decades, the portrait was little more than a pleasant curiosity, the kind of artwork that blended easily into the quiet background of history. It showed a boy no older than 10 or 11, seated upright, his posture careful but not stiff, his hands folded loosely in his lap. His expression was gentle, almost playful, with a faint smile that suggested ease rather than formality. There was nothing dramatic about him, nothing that demanded attention or hinted at tragedy. He wore simple but neat clothing, a light-colored shirt, well-pressed, and a jacket that fit him properly, not borrowed or oversized. His hair was combed, his skin softly illuminated by the painter's light. To anyone who glanced at the portrait without much thought, he looked like countless other children captured on canvas during the 19th century, sons of farmers, apprentices, shopkeepers, or minor gentry. He was simply a boy, frozen in paint, smiling patiently across time. The portrait hung for many years in a small regional museum, though before that it had passed through private hands, family estates, and storage rooms, where its origins grew increasingly vague. At some point, a handwritten label was attached to its frame, offering only a first name and an approximate date. No surname, no biographical note, just enough to satisfy cataloging requirements and nothing more. Visitors walked past it without lingering. School groups paused briefly while guides spoke of portrait techniques or period fashion, but the boy himself inspired no special comment. He did not depict a famous figure, a military hero, or a wealthy patron. He was not associated with any great historical event. In a gallery filled with grand oil paintings of landowners, governors, and dignified matrons, he seemed modest and unremarkable. That ordinariness was precisely why the portrait survived without scrutiny. Art historians often chase significance where it announces itself loudly, in lavish frames, in documented commissions, in recognizable names. His painting had none of those signals. It was competently done, but not by a master whose signature alone would spark curiosity. The background was neutral, the composition conventional. The artist had not attempted to mythologize the child or elevate him into allegory. The boy was presented plainly, as if the painter wished to preserve a moment rather than make a statement. Over time, the lack of drama became its own kind of camouflage. The portrait asked nothing of the viewer, and so it received little in return. In the 19th century, portraits of children were common among families who could afford them, and this painting fit comfortably within that tradition. Children were often painted not as they truly were in daily life, but as their families wished to see them, clean, calm, hopeful, and secure. The boy's slight smile aligned perfectly with this convention. It was the smile of a child encouraged to sit still, reassured by an adult just outside the frame, told that this moment mattered. There was no visible anxiety in his face, no hint of fear or fatigue. His eyes met the viewer's with quiet confidence. Nothing about him suggested hardship. If anything, the portrait seemed to promise a future filled with ordinary possibilities. For generations, assumptions filled the gaps left by missing information. Museum staff assumed the boy came from a local family of modest means. Visitors assumed he was free because the portrait gave no reason to think otherwise. In popular imagination, enslaved people were rarely associated with fine portraiture, especially children. When slavery appeared in art, it was usually in the background, anonymous and symbolic, stripped of individuality. This boy, by contrast, was centered, named, if only partially, and treated as worthy of remembrance. That alone pushed him outside the mental category most viewers held for enslaved children. The portrait reinforced a comfortable narrative that the past, while imperfect, followed predictable patterns that could be easily recognized. Even the smile itself worked to disarm curiosity. It was not a grin, not exaggerated or theatrical, but soft and sincere. It carried no visible strain. People tend to read smiles as evidence of contentment, or at least safety. The boy's expression suggested he was at ease in the world, or at least protected within it. That perception lingered long after viewers left the gallery. They remembered the portrait as sweet or charming, words that closed off deeper inquiry. The idea that the smile might conceal something darker did not occur to them, because nothing in the presentation invited such a thought. Time passed, and the portrait aged quietly. Its varnish yellowed slightly, its canvas loosened just enough to show its years. Occasionally, it was removed from display for cleaning or reframing, then returned to the wall with the same minimal description. Curators rotated exhibitions, storage inventories were updated, and the painting continued to exist as an object rather than a question. It survived renovations, funding cuts, and changes in museum leadership precisely because it caused no trouble. It did not challenge narratives or provoke debate. It was safe. In private homes, where it once hung, the portrait had served a similar role. It was decorative, perhaps sentimental, but never controversial. Families who inherited it did not know much about the boy, but they did not feel compelled to find out. He was simply part of the furniture of the past, a relic inherited along with land deeds, letters, and silverware. Over time, the story attached to him grew thinner, until eventually there was no story at all, just an image and a vague sense that it belonged to another time. What made the portrait particularly unassuming was how carefully it adhered to visual norms. The boy's clothing, while not extravagant, was respectable. There were no visible marks of labor, no torn fabric, no bare feet. His hands were clean, his nails trimmed. The painter had softened any roughness, as portraitists often did, smoothing away the irregularities of real life. This visual polishing made the boy legible to viewers as someone who fit comfortably within society's accepted boundaries. He looked like a child who was cared for, supervised, and valued. The painting offered no visual language for exploitation or bondage, and so those possibilities never entered the conversation. In the broader historical context, this invisibility was not unusual. Countless objects survive from the past, stripped of their deeper truths, their surfaces telling only what was considered acceptable to show. The portrait existed within that tradition of selective memory. It preserved an image but not a life. It offered a face but not a story. And because the face was calm and the image pleasant, it lulled viewers into accepting it at face value. There was no urgency to dig deeper, no sense that something vital had been omitted. Visitors sometimes paused in front of the portrait longer than they expected, drawn by the boy's gaze without knowing why. They felt a fleeting connection, a vague sense of familiarity. He reminded them of someone, a nephew, a childhood friend, a photograph in an old family album. That recognition created comfort, not curiosity. It reinforced the idea that the boy belonged to a shared, uncomplicated past. His smile became a bridge between centuries, inviting empathy without demanding understanding. Thus, the portrait lived its quiet life, doing exactly what it seemed designed to do, present an image that soothed rather than unsettled. It asked viewers to see a child and nothing more. In doing so, it succeeded for far longer than anyone realized. The painting's greatest deception was not in what it showed, but in what it allowed people to assume. By appearing ordinary, by conforming so perfectly to expectations, it concealed a reality that no one thought to question. The smiling boy remained just that, a smiling boy, until the day someone finally wondered why such a portrait existed at all. The first doubts did not arrive dramatically. There was no single revelation, no sudden announcement that overturned everything people thought they knew about the portrait. Instead, quest. Ions emerged slowly, almost accidentally, carried in by routine conservation work and casual scholarly curiosity. When the painting was removed from the wall for restoration, the conservator noticed that the canvas and pigments did not fully align with the period suggested on its label. The difference was subtle, nothing that would trouble a casual observer, but to trained eyes it hinted that the portrait might have been created slightly earlier than assumed. That small discrepancy was enough to open a narrow crack in the wall of certainty that had surrounded the painting for generations. As the surface grime and yellowed varnish were carefully removed, details that had long been muted began to reappear. The background, once thought to be a simple neutral tone, revealed faint objects painted so lightly they had nearly vanished with age. A shadowed corner suggested an interior space rather than an abstract backdrop. The brushwork around the boy's collar and cuffs showed an unusual restraint, as though the artist had intentionally avoided embellishment. This was not how most painters treated the clothing of freeborn children from families eager to signal respectability. There was care, yes, but also an odd plainness that now seemed deliberate rather than economical. The clothing itself became a subject of renewed attention. Textile historians compared the cut of the jacket and shirt to known examples from the era. While respectable, the garments lacked the small flourishes commonly found in portraits of children whose families could afford commissioned art. There were no decorative buttons, no embroidery, no personal tokens such as a locket or book. The clothes looked almost standardized, practical rather than expressive. At first, this was dismissed as a stylistic choice, but the more comparisons scholars made, the more the absence stood out. It was as if the boy had been dressed to appear presentable but not distinctive. The artist, once considered a minor and forgettable figure, also came under closer examination. Researchers traced his career through scattered records, discovering that he had spent much of his working life painting in regions heavily dependent on enslaved labor. He had produced portraits for plantation owners, overseers, and their families, people who could pay modest fees, but still wanted to record their place in the world. Among his known works were occasional paintings of individuals whose identities were unclear, labeled only by first names or vague descriptors. This pattern raised new questions about who he chose to paint and why. Archival research followed. Estate inventories, wills, and household records were examined, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes obsessively. In these documents, historians often encountered lists of enslaved individuals recorded not as people but as property, their names reduced to entries alongside furniture and livestock. In one such inventory, a familiar first name appeared, listed under children, valued at a price that fluctuated with age and perceived usefulness. The name was common enough to avoid immediate conclusions, but when paired with dates and locations matching the artist's movements, it began to feel less coincidental. Attention turned back to the portrait itself. Scholars began to notice how carefully the boy's posture was controlled. He sat upright, but there was a tension in his shoulders that suggested discipline rather than ease. His hands, while folded, were positioned in a way that minimized movement, as though he had been instructed not to fidget. This was not unusual in portraiture, but when combined with the other details, the plain clothing, the neutral background, the lack of personal objects, it painted a picture of restraint rather than expression. E-boy appeared composed, but not entirely free. Even the smile, long accepted as evidence of contentment, was re-examined. Facial expression experts noted that it was a practiced smile, one that did not fully engage the muscles around the eyes. It was polite, obedient, and measured. Such smiles were often taught to children expected to perform calmness and gratitude in front of authority. While this observation alone proved nothing, it added to the growing sense that the portrait was shaped by forces beyond simple parental affection. Museum records, once thought exhaustive, revealed gaps and inconsistencies. Early acquisition notes contained assumptions rather than verified facts. At some point, a curator had written believed to be, before describing the boy as freeborn, a phrase that later catalogues quietly omitted. The certainty of the label had hardened over time, even as its foundation remained weak. This realization unsettled staff members who began to understand how easily speculation could become accepted truth. The geographic context also mattered. The portrait's origin traced back to a region where laws strictly regulated the lives of enslaved people, including children. Baptismal records, census data, and tax documents painted a stark picture of a society where status was carefully recorded and rarely ambiguous. Yet here was a painting that seemed to blur those lines, presenting a child with dignity and individuality while offering no explicit acknowledgement of his legal condition. That contradiction demanded explanation. Some historians initially resisted the implications. The idea that an enslaved child might be portrayed so gently, so centrally, challenged common assumptions about both slavery and art. Skeptics argued that without explicit documentation, the theory risked projecting modern interpretations onto the past. But others countered that absence of evidence was itself a historical pattern, especially where enslaved lives were concerned. The lack of clear records did not mean the truth was simple. It often meant the truth had been deliberately obscured. As research deepened, small corroborations began to align. A plantation ledger mentioned payment to a local painter around the same time the portrait was believed to have been created. No subject was listed, only a sum of money and a brief note about likeness. Another document referenced a child described as remarkably fair-featured, a phrase that echoed contemporary descriptions of children chosen for domestic service or display. None of these fragments alone proved anything, but together they formed a constellation of possibility that was increasingly difficult to ignore. The portrait, once silent, now seemed crowded with unspoken information. Every brushstroke invited scrutiny. Every assumption demanded revalidation. What had once been seen as absence of drama, of symbolism, of story, was now understood as a presence of something carefully withheld. The painting had not lied outright. It had simply told the smallest possible truth, leaving everything else to be forgotten. By the time historians began to speak openly about their doubts, the portrait had already changed, not in appearance but in meaning. It could no longer be viewed as a harmless relic of domestic history. It had become a puzzle, a challenge, and a quiet accusation against the ease with which the past is simplified. The smiling boy was still there, calm and composed, but now his image was surrounded by questions that refused to fade. The deeper scholars looked, the clearer it became that the portrait's greatest clues were not hidden beneath layers of paint, but beneath layers of assumption that had gone unexamined for far too long. The moment the conclusion could no longer be avoided arrived quietly, not with celebration or shock, but with a heavy sense of inevitability. After months of cross-referencing records, debating interpretations, and revisiting assumptions, historians reached the point where the evidence aligned too closely to dismiss. The smiling boy in the portrait had not merely lived alongside slavery, nor been tangentially connected to it through household proximity. He had been born into it. His status was not incidental or temporary. It was fundamental to his existence from the moment he entered the world. What had once been speculation hardened into historical understanding, and with that shift came a profound re-evaluation of everything the portrait represented. The confirmation emerged from a convergence of documents rather than a single decisive record. Birth registers for enslaved children were rare and inconsistent, but plantation logs often noted increases in stock, particularly when those children were expected to survive infancy. In one such ledger, researchers found a brief entry listing a male child born to an enslaved woman whose name matched a figure already identified in related estate records. The date aligned closely with the estimated age of the boy in the painting. The owner of the plantation, known to have commissioned artwork during that period, had recorded the child as property in the same unemotional handwriting used for tools and livestock. The language was cold and transactional, yet it carried an unmistakable weight. This was not conjecture, it was documentation. That realization cast the portrait in a stark new light. The boy's individuality, once interpreted as evidence of freedom or affection, now appeared as an anomaly within a system designed to deny both. Enslaved children were rarely memorialized visually, especially not in formal portraiture. Their lives were meant to be productive, not commemorated, replaceable, not remembered. To paint such a child, to grant him the dignity of attention and permanence, ran counter to the logic of slavery itself. This contradiction demanded explanation, but it did not undo the fact of his status. Instead, it emphasized the complexity and cruelty of a system capable of occasional tenderness without surrendering control. Scholars revisited legal frameworks to understand how a child like him could exist simultaneously as a subject of art and an object of ownership. Laws in the region were clear. The status of the child followed that of the mother. If she was enslaved, so was her child, regardless of the father's identity or the child's appearance. Freedom was not a matter of temperament or talent. It was inherited bondage. The portrait, in its careful neutrality, had erased this legal reality, presenting a version of the boy stripped of context. What viewers saw was a sea-hilled. What the law saw was property. This duality sharpened the emotional impact of the discovery. The smile that had once seemed gentle now felt unsettling, not because it was false, but because it existed within such constrained circumstances. Enslaved children learned early how to read expectations, how to present themselves in ways that minimized punishment and maximized approval. A composed demeanor, a polite expression, a willingness to comply. These were survival skills as much as social graces. The portrait captured a moment shaped by those pressures, even if the painter did not fully acknowledge them. The historians involved in the research struggled with their own reactions. Many had spent careers studying slavery, yet encountering it through the intimate lens of a child's portrait proved uniquely disturbing. Statistics and narratives of labor could be intellectually processed. A painted face demanded a different kind of reckoning. The boy's humanity was undeniable, yet his humanity had coexisted with a legal framework that denied it. The painting forced scholars to confront how easily art could soften or obscure brutal realities. Public reaction, once the findings were shared, ranged from disbelief to quiet grief. Visitors who had seen the portrait before returned to it with altered eyes. Some felt betrayed by the museum's earlier presentation, while others expressed guilt for having accepted the original assumptions without question. The institution itself grappled with how to present the information responsibly. To simply relabel the painting felt insufficient. To dramatize the revelation risked sensationalism. The challenge lay in honoring the boy's truth without turning his life into a spectacle. As discussions unfolded, historians emphasized that the discovery did not make the portrait an exception that proved the rule of cruelty with occasional kin. Deness. Instead, it illuminated how slavery permeated every aspect of society, including art and memory. The fact that the boy could be depicted with care did not mitigate his bondage. It demonstrated how enslavers could reconcile affection with ownership. This uncomfortable coexistence was not rare. It was foundational to the system's endurance. The boy's name, once partial and uncertain, gained clarity through the records. It appeared repeatedly in documents tied to the same estate, always without a surname, always followed by descriptors of age or value. The absence of a family name underscored his lack of legal identity beyond ownership. Yet the portrait had preserved his face with remarkable specificity, giving him a presence denied in text. This contrast between visual recognition and legal erasure became one of the most powerful aspects of the story. The discovery also reframed questions about why the portrait existed at all. While those motivations would be explored more deeply later, the certainty of the boy's enslaved status eliminated comforting interpretations. The painting was not evidence of benevolent exception, it was evidence of selective visibility. The boy had been seen when it suited others to see him, remembered when it aligned with someone else's purpose. His image survived, not because his life was valued equally, but because it intersected with the desires of those who held power over him. For historians, acknowledging the truth meant resisting the urge to fill gaps with hopeful speculation. There was no record of emancipation for the boy, no letter describing his later life, no confirmation of whether he survived into adulthood. The silence that followed the portrait was itself part of the story. Enslaved lives often vanished from the archive once they ceased to serve a clear economic function. The painting stood as a rare interruption in that. Silence, but it did not resolve it. The weight of the conclusion reshaped how the portrait was experienced. The boy's calm gaze now carried an implied question: what does it mean to be seen yet not recognized? To be remembered in form but not in truth? His smile no longer invited easy sentiment, it demanded reflection. It asked viewers to consider how many other images, documents, and stories carried similar omissions, waiting for someone to look closer. By establishing that the boy was born enslaved, historians did more than correct a label. They challenged a broader habit of interpreting the past through surfaces alone. The portrait had always been honest in its own limited way. It showed what the painter painted. The dishonesty lay in the assumptions layered onto it over time, assumptions shaped by comfort and convention. Stripping those away revealed not just the boy's status, but the mechanisms by which history itself can be misread. The discovery did not close the story, it opened it. Knowing the truth about the boy's birth transformed the portrait from a quiet artifact into a testimony. It stood as evidence that slavery was not only a system of labor, but a system that shaped how people were seen, recorded, and remembered. The smiling boy remained exactly as he had always been on the canvas, but the world around him had changed. At last, he was no longer mistaken for what he was not. Once the truth of the boy's birth was established, attention shifted inevitably toward the most unsettling question of all: why this portrait existed in the first place. In a society where enslaved children were rarely granted individuality in records, let alone immortalized in oil and canvas, the decision to commission such a painting demanded explanation. Historians approached the question cautiously, aware that motives in the past were often layered, contradictory, and uncomfortable. There would be no single answer, no tidy justification that made sense of the choice without exposing the moral fractures beneath it. The most immediate possibility was affection, a word that sat uneasily beside ownership. Enslavers sometimes formed emotional attachments to enslaved children who lived and worked within their households, especially those assigned to domestic roles. These children were visible daily, trained to be attentive, gentle, and compliant. Over time, familiarity could blur into fondness without ever threatening the underlying hierarchy. The portrait could have been born from such an attachment, a desire to preserve the likeness of a child who brought comfort, pride, or companionship. Yet affection within bondage did not negate control. It often reinforced it, recasting domination as care. Another possibility lay in vanity and display. Portraiture in the 19th century was not only about memory but about message. Paintings communicated status, refinement, and authority. To commission a portrait of an enslaved child, particularly one presented with calm dignity, could signal a certain kind of power. It suggested that the owner's household was so ordered, so secure, that even those at the bottom of its hierarchy appeared content. The image became a quiet assertion of control, a visual argument that the system functioned smoothly under the owner's guidance. In this reading, the boy's composed smile was not incidental, it was essential. Some scholars explored the notion of sentimentality shaped by denial. For individuals who benefited from slavery yet struggled with its moral implications, selective tenderness offered psychological relief. By focusing on one child's perceived happiness, an enslaver could reassure themselves that the system was not entirely cruel. The portrait became a tool of self-deception, freezing a moment that supported a comforting narrative while ignoring the broader reality of coercion and suffering. Art, in this sense, did not challenge conscience, it anesthetized it. The possibility of lineage also hovered unspoken but undeniable. In slave societies, relationships between enslavers and enslaved women were common and often violent, though rarely acknowledged openly. Children born from such unions occupied a fraught space, their existence a reminder of exploitation that polite society preferred to ignore. While definitive evidence was absent, the boy's careful presentation invited speculation. Portraiture could serve as a compromise between acknowledgement and erasure, recognizing the child's existence without granting legitimacy or freedom. The painting allowed the boy to be seen without being named fully, cherished without being claimed publicly. The artist's role further complicated the question. Painters worked at the pleasure of their patrons, adapting their style and subject matter to satisfy commissions. Yet artists were also observers, sensitive to faces, expressions, and human presence. It is possible the painter recognized something compelling in the boy, a quiet intelligence, a striking calm, and wished to capture it. This impulse did not require moral courage, it required only artistic instinct. But once filtered through the patron's intentions, that instinct became part of a larger narrative shaped by power. The brush recorded what was allowed to be recorded. Financial motives cannot be dismissed either. Commissioning a portrait was an expense, but not an extravagant one for a plantation owner accustomed to measuring value in human lives. The cost of the painting was negligible compared to the wealth generated by enslaved labor. In that context, the portrait may have been a casual indulgence, commissioned without deep reflection. Its very existence could reflect how normalized ownership had become, how little thought was given to the contradiction of portraying property as person. Historians also considered the role of discipline and expectation. Enslaved children were trained early to perform obedience, gratitude, and calmness, especially in front of authority. Sitting for a portrait would have been an exercise in such performance. The boy's stillness, his measured smile, his direct gaze, all could reflect hours of instruction and correction. The painting captured not only his likeness, but the success of that training. In this interpretation, the portrait functioned as evidence of control, a visual confirmation that the child knew his place and occupied it gracefully. Religious rationalizations offered another layer. Many enslavers framed their actions within a belief that slavery was divinely sanctioned and that they were stewards responsible for the spiritual guidance of those they owned. A portrait of an enslaved child could fit within this worldview as a symbol of benevolent guardianship. The painting reassured the patron that they were not merely extracting labor, but shaping souls. This belief, however sincere, did nothing to alter the child's lack of autonomy. It simply wrapped domination in moral language. What made the portrait especially revealing was what it did not show. There were no tools of labor, no signs of servitude, no markers of the boy's daily reality. The absence was intentional, whether consciously or instinctively. By removing all references to bondage, the painting constructed an alternate version of truth, one that felt acceptable, even gentle. This selective vision allowed the viewer then and now to engage with the image without confronting the system that defined the boy's life. The portrait was not lying, it was editing. The decision to create such an image also reflected broader cultural tensions of the time. As debates over slavery intensified, representations of enslaved people became politically charged. Some images emphasized suffering to argue for abolition. Others emphasized contentment to defend the status quo. While this portrait was private rather than overtly political, it existed within that visual economy. Its quietness did not make it neutral. By presenting an enslaved child as serene and well cared for, it aligned subtly with narratives that minimized brutality. Yet the portrait also resisted complete containment. Despite the intentions behind it, the boy's humanity seeped through the frame. His presence exceeded the role assigned to him by law and by patron. This excess, the irreducible fact of a person, may explain why the painting endured. It was commissioned for one purpose, but it survived for another. Over time, it outlived the justifications that created it, waiting for viewers willing to see beyond its surface. In confronting why the portrait was made, historians found no comfort. Each plausible motive revealed another facet of a system that could accommodate contradiction without collapse, affection without freedom, beauty without justice, memory without acknowledgement. The painting became a mirror reflecting not only the past, but the mechanisms by which people rationalize inequality. It showed how easily art could be enlisted to soften reality, and how difficult it was to disentangle genuine human feeling from structures of power. Ultimately, the portrait's creation could not be redeemed by intention. Whatever care or curiosity prompted it, the act of painting did not alter the boy's legal or lived condition. It froze a moment of visibility within a lifetime of constraint. That freeze frame was both gift and theft, a rare record of an enslaved child's face, and a removal of the context that defined his existence. The question, why the portrait was created, led not to resolution, but to recognition. It forced viewers to accept that beauty and injustice had coexisted comfortably, and that art had often been the space where that coexistence was made to look natural. After the truth emerged, the portrait could no longer occupy the quiet, decorative role it had held for so long. Its meaning shifted irrevocably, not because the paint had changed, but because the story surrounding it finally aligned with the reality it had concealed. What was once an image of harmless charm became a sight of reckoning. The smiling boy was no longer an anonymous child from a distant past. He was a witness, a reminder, and a challenge to how history chooses what to remember and what to forget. Museums and historians faced the difficult task of reframing the portrait without stripping it of its complexity. To explain the boy's enslaved status was not enough. The discovery demanded a broader confrontation with the ways enslaved lives had been flattened, softened, or erased altogether. The portrait became a case study in historical misreading, showing how easily surface impressions could override deeper truths. Visitors who stood before it now did so with unease, aware that what they were seeing was only a fraction of what had been lived. The boy's smile, once interpreted as innocent happiness, acquired layers of meaning that resisted simplification. It could no longer be read as proof of contentment, nor dismissed as mere performance. Instead, it stood at the intersection of resilience and constraint. Enslaved children often learned to smile not because life was kind, but because survival depended on appearing agreeable. The smile became a strategy, a learned expression shaped by power dynamics rather than free choice. Yet acknowledging this did not strip it of humanity. The smile might still have been genuine in its moment, reflecting warmth, curiosity, or hope, even as it existed within profound limitation. Holding these possibilities together became part of the portrait's enduring tension. As the story spread beyond academic circles, the portrait began to resonate with people in unexpected ways. Descendants of enslaved communities saw in the boy a reflection of countless ancestors whose faces were never recorded, whose lives existed only in fragments of ledgers and bills of sale. The painting's survival felt both miraculous and painful, a rare visual trace that underscored how much had been lost. For others, especially those raised on sanitized versions of history, the portrait disrupted comfortable narratives. It demonstrated that slavery was not an abstract system affecting faceless masses, but a daily reality shaping the lives of children with expressions, personalities, and inner worlds. The portrait also forced institutions to reckon with their own roles in preserving partial truths. For years, the museum had displayed the painting without questioning its assumptions, not out of malice, but out of habit. That realization prompted broader reviews of collections, labels, and archives. How many other objects carried similar silences? How many stories had been simplified to avoid discomfort? The boy's image became a catalyst, encouraging a more critical approach to historical interpretation, one that treated absence as meaningful rather than incidental. Importantly, the rediscovery did not transform the boy into a symbol detached from his individuality. Historians resisted the temptation to turn him into a generic representative of enslaved childhood. His specific circumstances mattered: the place he lived, the people who claimed ownership over him, the moment in which his likeness was captured. By grounding the story in detail, scholars honored the fact that enslaved people were not interchangeable. Each life unfolded differently, shaped by countless variables that records often failed to capture. At the same time, the portrait illuminated broader patterns of erasure. Enslaved children were routinely denied the markers of personhood that free society took for granted: surnames, recorded birthdays, formal education, legal recognition of family bonds. The painting contradicted that denial by preserving a face with striking clarity, yet it also highlighted how selective remembrance could be. The boy was remembered visually but not narratively. His image survived while his voice, thoughts, and future disappeared into silence. This imbalance became one of the portrait's most powerful lessons. The act of reinterpreting the portrait raised ethical questions about ownership of history. Who has the right to tell this boy's story? How should his image be used now that its context is known? Museums grappled with these questions publicly, engaging communities and scholars in dialogue rather than issuing definitive statements. The goal was not closure, but responsibility, an acknowledgement that historical understanding is ongoing and that humility is essential when dealing with lives shaped by injustice. For viewers, encountering the portrait after learning the truth often produced a sense of intimacy tinged with grief. The boy's gaze seemed more direct, as though asking to be seen fully at last. His calm expression no longer. Reassured, it invited reflection. People lingered longer in front of the painting, reading explanatory texts carefully, returning their eyes to the canvas again and again. The portrait demanded time, something it had been denied for generations. In classrooms and lectures, the image became a teaching tool that transcended statistics. Students who struggled to connect emotionally with the history of slavery found themselves drawn into the story through the boy's face. Discussions moved beyond dates and laws toward questions of perception, memory, and moral responsibility. How many other histories had been shaped by similar misreadings? How often did images reinforce what people wanted to believe rather than what was true? The portrait opened these conversations without offering easy answers. The rediscovery also challenged assumptions about progress. It was tempting to frame the revelation as a triumph of modern scholarship over past ignorance, but historians cautioned against such self-congratulation. The evidence had always been there, scattered across archives and records. What changed was the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions and to accept unsettling conclusions. The portrait reminded audiences that history does not reveal itself automatically. It requires active, often painful engagement. Perhaps the most enduring impact of the discovery lay in its quiet insistence on recognition. The boy did not become famous in the conventional sense. His life did not suddenly acquire a complete narrative or a heroic arc. Instead, he gained something subtler but profound: acknowledgement. He was no longer misidentified, no longer absorbed into a comforting fiction. His existence as an enslaved child was named and affirmed, however belatedly. That act of naming mattered. In the end, the portrait's power rested not in resolving the boy's story, but in refusing to let fade again into anonymity. It stood as a reminder that history is not only what is recorded, but how it is interpreted. The smiling boy had always been present, looking outward from the canvas. What changed was the gaze returned to him. Once viewers learned who he truly was, they could no longer look away so easily. The painting remained what it had always been, a portrait of a child, frozen in a moment of stillness, yet its meaning expanded, carrying the weight of countless untold stories alongside one visible face. The boy's smile, once taken at face value, became an invitation to see deeper, to question surfaces, to challenge inherited assumptions, and to recognize the humanity that persists even when history tries to hide it. Through that recognition, the portrait achieved a significance far greater than its creator ever intended.